Good morning, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome a very special guest today with us. We have Paul Levinson, who is an author, creator of songs, as I have read online. I don't know how much true is in that.
It's completely true.
Okay.
I'll sing a song for you if you like.
Okay.
No, I'm only, go ahead.
I would love to listen to some of your songs. And also, Paul Lawson is a professor of communication and media studies. And today, he will be making a presentation which is titled Dune on page versus screen. And now it's all up to you, sir. Please begin.
Producing music has always been something that is almost the same as writing words and studying profound intellectual topics. There's really not that much difference, at least for me. And in a way, talking about films and talking about science fiction novels, if anything, is probably more like music than studying Immanuel Kant or a traditional philosopher. And the last point I'll make about that before I start with my little lecture is one of the best and most significant things that I've ever seen in my life is Peter Jackson's 3-part documentary, The Beatles Get Back, which I highly recommend. And it almost looks like you go into a time machine and you're back in 1969. That's how good the sound quality and the quality of the visuals are in that documentary. But let's talk about Dune. As I'm sure everyone watching this and listening to this knows, an adaptation of Dune just came out about a month or two ago. This is the second time that someone has tried to take the novel and, in a sense, the overall Dune series and put it on a screen. The first time was back in the 1980s. This was a David Lynch production, the 1980s version. It's generally agreed that the 2021 version is much, much better than the David Lynch version, which is saying a lot because David Lynch has had a wonderful career as a filmmaker, doing all kinds of extremely important things like Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet. So, you know, there were high hopes for his movie back in the 1980s. And by and large, however, most people feel he did not do that good a job. And I'll try to explain in a few minutes why I think that was not the case. But the first point I want to make when talking about Dune, both the 2021 movie and the original novel and the series, is a human psychological trait that I identified and came across years ago. I call it the first love syndrome. And that's a nice fancy phrase, right? What it means is I came to realize that often when people talk about novels and their adaptations into movies and then more recently television series, the most important thing in terms of what they most like is what they first experienced. And we tend to think that, oh, the novel is always better than the adaptation, but that's usually because for most people, we already read the novel before we saw the adaptation. And so what happens when you read a novel, as we well know, psychologically, you make a movie of it in your mind. You know, you've heard the expression theater of the mind. The act of reading a work of fiction is to put in motion a theatrical presentation in your mind. And you know what works best for you, right? It's your mind. Everyone has a different mind. And so if you read a novel and you say, oh my God, I just love this novel, I'm inhabiting the novel. The novel is inside me. What that really means is you have created a motion picture in your head that you feel really works for you. So if you think about that, you can realize how difficult it is when someone else makes a motion picture of that. And furthermore, it's not even that person's mind, it's the director and filmmaker's attempt to put what's in his or her mind out there on the screen. And it's bound to be a disappointment to you. The first time I realized that, I was at a science fiction convention and we were talking about Star Trek. And we were talking about some of the television and movie adaptations of Star Trek. And someone in the audience, a young man, raised his hand and said, "My favorite Star Trek is Star Trek the Motion Picture. I really love that. Better than the television series, better than any series." And at first I was stunned. I mean, I thought maybe I didn't hear this guy correctly. I said, "You're telling me you loved Star Trek the Motion Picture, came out in the early 1980s, better than Star Trek the original series, better than Kirk and Spock, better than Star Trek the Next Generation, Picard and Data?" And the guy said, "Yeah, that's what I'm telling you." And I said, "So just to satisfy my interest, which of those two things, of all the Star Trek series, and did you see first?" And he said, "Well, it was the movie. I hadn't seen any of the other television series. I went to see the movie, and then when I watched the series, it just didn't seem as exciting to me as the movie." Now, I think Star Trek, the motion picture, the first Star Trek movie, is okay, but I think it's generally and correctly recognized as not a very good motion picture. It was all right, not the greatest. Certainly doesn't hold a candle to Star Trek, the original series, or Star Trek, the Next Generation. None of those things, in fact, hold a candle to the original series. And that's what gave me the idea and the realization that it's not just saying which is aesthetically better, which works better. It has to do with what you first experienced. And after that, I noticed, when people were saying, "Well, which did you like better, Lord of the Rings," or back to Peter Jackson, his Lord of the Rings trilogy. People who read Tolkien's novels always thought, well, Peter Jackson's works were good. They were good, but they were not great. And when it was the other way around, when people had seen the movies first and then went to read the novels, they thought the novels were excellent, but just didn't stand up to the movies and what they saw in the movies. So I think we have to consider that first love principle whenever we are trying to evaluate which is better, which does more or less. Because of that, I also noticed a very interesting thing, and this was really more recent, and that is that the adaptations which tended to get the most immediate love and adulation were those that made major changes from the original, so major that someone who loved the original could take the adaptation as something new and like and come to love it on its own terms. And so the question is, well, how much of a change do you have to make? Well, in my view, one of the best adaptations is the Amazon Prime television series, The Man in the High Castle, which of course is an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's award-winning novel, The Man in the High Castle. In my view, one of the best novels I've ever read. By the way, right up there with Dune and Foundation. I would highly recommend The Man in the High Castle. one of the reasons why I thought that was so successful is because the Amazon Prime Video presentation introduced a character, John Smith, who wasn't even in the original novel. And not only that, they got a brilliant actor to play that part, Rufus Sewell. And in fact, I interviewed Rufus Sewell. I was teaching a class from page to screen, similar to what I'm talking to you about right now this past summer. And I was able to get Rufus Sewell through Zoom to come by my class. And we had a 90-minute interview. So you can just search for this on YouTube. And Sewell explains how when he sat down with Frank Spotnitz, who was the person who put the series together, they discussed how this new character would change the very nature of Philip K. Dick's book while attempting to be true to it. And I think it succeeded marvelously. Around the same time as Dune, the first part of the two-part movie, debuted, and this is just in the last couple of months, another incredibly path-breaking science fiction series came to the screen. And as a matter of fact, in my view, I would say that the Dune series is the second best science fiction series, the book series, that I've ever read. So that's high praise. I probably read, I don't know, thousands of different stories. And I think that the Dune universe is a marvelous, brilliant, multifaceted, deeply layered universe with all kinds of different themes, ranging from faster than light travel by folding space to the Bene Gesserit or Gesserit. I don't know to this day how to pronounce that, by the way. And the power of this group of women who in many ways control the destiny of many of the people in that story. So I think that Dune is in a class by itself, but I consider it the second best series because you might ask, what do I think was the first best series? That would be Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and the Foundation trilogy. For a variety of reasons. And, since this isn't about Foundation, I'm not going to talk too much about Foundation, but I will say that for those of you who are interested in philosophy, the Foundation trilogy is the world's best science fiction for considering a profound philosophic issue, which is, if you could have knowledge of the future, if you, in effect, accepted the philosophy of de Lamartine, the French philosopher who said, the whole universe is like a clockwork organization, and if you could understand how it's ticking, you could predict where it's going to be a year from now, a decade from now, a millennium from now. That is a point of view that many scientists actually have. And in the Foundation trilogy, Isaac Asimov starts the trilogy by positing that here is this brilliant thinker, Harry Seldon, who is able to figure out how that universe is working, his so-called psychohistory, and predict where things are going. And in one of the most exciting parts of the Foundation trilogy, in the story called The General, here the old empire still is powerful, has an incredibly powerful general, attacks the Foundation, but the Foundation wins because it's in the right place at the right time. But not to give too much away, if you haven't read the Foundation, right after the general comes another character called the Mule, who's a mutation, not predictable, therefore, by Harry Seldon's history. And that changes things completely. So in terms of this philosophic question, if you have knowledge, what can you understand and what will you be unable to understand. There's no better story than the Foundation trilogy and the Foundation series. And by a stroke of good fortune, these two best, first best and second best, their visual presentations debuted at almost precisely the same time, just a couple of months ago. I mean, that's really amazing. You know, there was no coordination between the two productions. It just happened that way. This, by the way, not to get too deeply into philosophy, but I'll just throw in here, this is another expression of what Hegel referred to as the spirit of an age. And as you may know, Hegel in his work said there are just times in history when certain forces come together and make a lot of things happen that are related to each other. So if you're studying the history of popular culture and art, for example, you notice that in the late 1800s, there was Impressionism. What was Impressionism? It was a kind of art. It was a kind of poetry. It was a kind of music. So you have Monet and Manet, that's art. You have impressionistic poets, and you have impressionistic music. Claude Debussy and his Afternoon of the Faun, beautiful impressionistic piece. So you have three different kinds of art, and they're all talking to us as human beings from a similar perspective through different media. And I think we're seeing a spirit of an age in terms of great science fiction coming to the screen. Now, I already mentioned The Man in the High Castle, so that wasn't precisely at the same time as Dune and Foundation, but it's certainly part of our time. Now, let's get back, though, more specifically to Dune for a few minutes. And 1980s film versus the 21st movie, obviously. One of the problems bringing science fiction to the screen, and one of the problems that Dune specifically entailed, that is the bringing of Dune to the screen, is there is such a grandeur in the Dune story. Just think of like one scene, the wind-swept, sand-swept terrain of Dune, the immensity of that. And this is like, to cite another philosopher, Blaise Pascal, when the Pascal mused about the of the human being when we contemplate the grandeur of the cosmos. We're infinitesimal compared to that grandeur. Well, when you read Dune and you look at those sand-swept environments, not to mention the sandworm and all those things, there's an enormity there that you get when you're reading the words. But that's not easy to portray on the screen. And that's one of the reasons why I think the David Lynch movie, he gave it a good try, but they just didn't have the technology then to do it. But the 2021 movie did and does. And so one of the reasons why I think that's such a thrilling movie to see and so satisfying is that movie was up to the task of meeting the theater of the mind that all readers of Dune had. And it's interesting that, and here Dune becomes exceptional, different from The Man in the High Castle and different from Foundation, because it was so true to the original novel. And let me just fill in a detail there. I mentioned that The Man in the High Castle introduced the character of John Smith. Well, the Foundation first season, at least, they introduced something very new to Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories as well. In Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories, there was an emperor by the name of Cleon, one guy, an emperor. He set a lot of things in motion. But in the David Goyer television series, that one emperor becomes a triumvirate of clones, uh, Brother Dawn, Brother Day, and Brother Dusk. If you haven't seen that, you don't know what I'm talking about. I won't give too much away in case you haven't seen it. I highly recommend it. But again, I think that Foundation succeeded, and it's just the first of, I think there are going to be 8 seasons of it, 10 episodes each. It broke the hold of the first love syndrome by putting something completely not in Isaac Asimov's story in that Dune, in that Foundation trilogy. Just as The Man in the High Castle did that with John Smith. Dune courageously didn't do that. They stuck very, very carefully to the original. So for people who, and anyone who's read the novel, they're waiting to see these things happen. And the way they happened was very, very satisfying and gratifying in the Dune movie. I'll just mention one more point, and then I could talk about this for hours, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about this. I just came across something very, very recently, and I thought of you, that is this conference, when I saw this, and you'll know why in a minute. Uh, the Foundation trilogy and the Foundation series was written by Isaac Asimov, who, in my view, because I put the Foundation series in first place, is the greatest science fiction writer in history. Better than H.G. Wells, better than Jules Verne, better than Philip K. Dick, better than Frank Herbert, even though those people are all superb. But in addition to the Foundation trilogy, Isaac Asimov also happened to write my favorite time travel novel, The End of Eternity. And I have to tell you, I'm the kind of person, when I really love something, I try, if possible, to also create my own version of it. So I haven't yet written a Foundation trilogy or anything like Dune, but I have written a few time travel novels, The Plot to Save Socrates, and there are 2 sequels to that, Unburning, Alexandria, and Chronica. And every time I write anything with time travel, there's a part of my brain that is replaying The End of Eternity. That's how important that novel was to me. It was written in 1955. I read it when I was just an infant in 1959. I was a little older than an infant, but I was just really a kid. And I remember it blew my mind. I just loved it. Anyway, I discovered just recently that there was a Soviet adaptation of The End of Eternity made in 1987. And the first thing I thought when I saw something about that is, I said, oh, this can't be any good. Are you kidding? But nonetheless, you have to, and to get back to philosophy, as Kant said, Immanuel Kant, there are 2 parts to understanding. There's what your cognitive structures are, what you have in your head already, but then there's the confrontation of that with real experience. That's where knowledge comes from. So I had this idea that, hey, this is probably a ridiculous travesty of a movie. But I just saw the movie. It's in 2 parts. It's 2 hours long. It's on YouTube. So I don't know if YouTube is available in Poland. It's in Russian. I don't speak Russian, or certainly I don't read Russian, but they're pretty good English subtitles. And here's the point I'm making. Way back in 1987, this movie was made, and you know what? It is a surprisingly good movie. I didn't expect it to be good. And it did the same thing that the Dune movie did in 2021, that the Foundation series and The Man in the High Castle did not do. It told that story, the end of eternity, that marvelous time travel story, completely by expressing the original. It didn't introduce new characters, didn't go in different directions. So I have to give that Soviet filmmaker credit. Even the acting was pretty good, by the way. So I'm just throwing that in there because I think that that movie, The End of Eternity, the Soviet adaptation, Isaac Asimov, by the way, was born in Russia. I think back in 1920. It makes sense that there would be an affinity, any work of Isaac Asimov and anything having to do with Russia. But they got it. They got it very well. I'm just like one point, in case any of you have read The End of Eternity and know the story, I won't give anything away, but one of the prime characters in that novel is the All-When Council. Allwhen, all when. And they had that council in the movie. And I realized that the Soviets knew how to portray that because that council looked like a Politburo in the movie. The All When Council in that time travel movie felt very much like the Soviet Politburo, or what I know about it. I never witnessed it personally. If I ever got to the Soviet Union back in the old days, I probably would not have gotten out of there. They probably would have thrown me in some gulag. But the point is, I really give that movie credit, and I highly recommend it to all of you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and happy to answer any of them.
Thank you, sir, for this marvelous production. We have a couple of questions for you. The first one is about the new series Foundation. And because the cast in this series was made much more multicultural, and also feminine figures appeared, because Asimov, who was writing in the specific age of Russia history, he was mostly just making it about this social ethnical background. And how do you think this transposition made the great success of this interpretation possible?
I very much like that transition or transformation, and some of it was actually very clever as well. So in the original, the first Foundation novel, there was a character, Gal Dornick, who in the novel actually is a pretty minor character. He's like a boring mathematician. You don't really know much about him. He's almost just, he's what they call in writing an occasion for an info dump, meaning he just dumps information out there so we get it. In the Apple TV Plus rendition of that same story and that same character, they take the name Gal, which is spelled by Asimov Gaal, and they pronounce it Gal, which is fine with me, and they make it a woman character. They do the same thing with Salvar Hardin, who was a man in the Foundation stories. And I think, and they do the same, and probably most significantly, with the robot character, who, by the way, Asimov liked blending his stories together. So in Asimov's robot stories, even independent of the Foundation, there was a robot by the name of R. Daniel Oliva. You can look up the spelling of that. Asimov took that character and put him into the Foundation stories later on in the 1980s and made the character Demerzel, which, you know, is a genderless name. So in the novel, and again, this came out in the 1980s, it was one of the prequels Demerzel is a masculine robot. I mean, deep down, he's neither male nor female, but the flesh that he has on, or whatever it is, makes him look like a man. Well, in the Foundation television series, the character is a woman, and very, very well played. So I like those changes. I just want to say one thing though, in Isaac Asimov's defense, he's often criticized as not giving women much of a role, but in the Foundation trilogy, there are a few women characters. Beta Darrell, for example, I mean, she saves the Foundation. So again, I don't want to give too much away. She is a major character. Her granddaughter, Arcady Darrell, plays a major role as well. And in the robot stories, the main intellect, the human being who understands the robots, is Susan Calvin. She's obviously a woman too. So in all fairness to Asimov, yeah, he was a product of his times. He tended to write male characters more than female characters, but he did have some female characters. By the way, I should mention, I'm not like Isaac Asimov when it comes to female characters. The heroine of The Plot to Save Socrates on Burning Alexandria and Chronica trilogy is Sierra Waters, who is a graduate student, a young woman in New York in the 2040s. So I like writing women characters.
So you have said about Hegel's spirit of history. And I have a question about Hegel's dialectic, which makes its way back to Foundation. Because as you said, Harry Seldon, Psychohistory, was a brilliant deterministic way of knowing exactly what will happen in the future. But there was a mutation which happened to make the previous predictions obsolete. And one way of understanding Hegel's dialectic is that we have thesis, an antithesis, and they together make the synthesis. So all movies are great. Titanic is not a very good movie, so most movies are great, but not Titanic. And the other way of understanding Hegel's dialectic is the way that was introduced mainly by Slavoj Žižek. And he interprets this philosophy as a dualistic philosophy of synthesis and antithesis, meaning that they cannot exist without one another. So to project it onto the idea of psychohistory, which was presented in Foundation, only because there was a mutation which made the predictions obsolete, the prediction was able to be made in the first place. And what do you think about this idea? That it was the only way that it could happen?
I have a few responses to that question. In the first place, I think Hegel's spirit of an age can be understood without any reference to the dialectic, synthesis, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then the synthesis generates a new antithesis, etc. You don't need that as the explanation for why it is that in certain times in history, everything seems to come together in a cultural sense. And in fact, I don't know what the reason for that is. I think it's just enough to recognize it, meaning that popular culture is not just the haphazard thing that sometimes we think it is. It's not just something that's the result of very rich people coming up with enough money to finally make a series or a movie. Those are all factors, but there is something deeper in the culture and deeper in human beings and in our expression of cultures, which leads to this spirit of an age. And so that I think is an important thing to keep in mind. However, that said, I think, yes, in order for a thesis to be understood, you have to have an antithesis or an antithesis, because it's the antithesis which sheds light on the thesis and then makes it easier to understand, and in fact helps the thesis evolve into something new. And so in foundation, the mule indeed is the antithesis of the thesis Harry Seldon's psychohistory. And however, and that's a very exciting thing dramatically and in the narration, but it did not destroy psychohistory. It educated psychohistory. And that's why Asimov brilliantly puts into the novel, well, there's a second foundation. And the second foundation, in effect, comes into its own, achieves a position of prominence because it is the answer to the mule, not the original foundation. And that is a classic synthesis and a progression of knowledge and understanding. Or, in other words, psychohistory is not just Harry Seldon mapped out this future, and all you have to do is passively become aware of it, or maybe not even become aware of it. Everything is going to be okay as long as you follow the mathematical direction. That's what the original thesis was. But the antithesis of the mule shows that in order for psychohistory to have lasting impact, it has to be living. It can't just be Harry Seldon's mathematical equations. And so that's what the second foundation is for, a group of brilliant mathematicians who take Harry Seldon's equations and are constantly working them and figuring out where things are going to go. So I think in that sense, the foundation story does indeed capture Hegel's dialectic. By the way, let me throw one other thing in here. One of the things I hadn't mentioned is I've done a lot of work with Marshall McLuhan. And in fact, my three nonfiction books that have been translated into Polish, The Soft Edge, Cell Phone, and New Media, all deal heavily with Marshall McLuhan's work. McLuhan attempted to expand the three-part dialectic into what he, McLuhan, called the tetrad, Tetrad, a four-part structure about with the impact that technologies have on our lives. And he thought that was a better way, a more accurate way of mapping out these changes. Even though I have been identified as a student and a proponent of McLuhan's work, I think the tetrad is very valuable, but I think you can have both Hegel's dialectic and McLuhan's tetrad. You don't need both. You don't need to have one or the other. In other words, it's like the first foundation and the second foundation. You really need the two of them. Let me also say, by the way, I'm going to put into the chat, assuming that I think this should do it. I just put a link in to a review. I was thinking about that Soviet movie, The End of Eternity, and I wrote a review actually just last night. So you can read my review in that link. And that also has a link to the YouTube 2-hour presentation of that 1987 movie, The End of Eternity. It also has links to my interview with Rufus Sewell, and it has links to a discussion I had with a group of reviewers about Foundation. So you might find that of interest. Last but not least, let me also mention to anyone who's listening to this, my Twitter handle is at Paul Lev. That's PAULLEV, at Paul Lev. I'll type that in here just so everyone has it. And if anybody has any questions after all this is over, feel free to tweet the questions to me. I always answer questions, and I'd always be happy to hear from you. So thank you for inviting me. I had a good time. I enjoyed Harry Seldon's lecture, even though we couldn't ask him any questions. And this is a good conference.
Hey, thank you greatly for your time and effort, and we are sorry for the inconveniences, but most of all, we are very happy that we have had you here with us.